Let's go ahead and look at Spanish and colonial painting of the Baroque period. So we're going to primarily be looking at the Iberian Peninsula today. We'll continue looking at some of the colonies of the Spanish Empire, but one of the things that you might notice just from this map is that Spain was controlled by the Spanish Habsburgs. And not only did they have territories on the Iberian Peninsula, but they also had some islands in the Mediterranean, the lower southern part of Italy, as well as up in Flanders and in Holland. And so because of that connection with Flanders and Holland, we should assume that we're going to see some Flemish characteristics to some of the painting. So during the Baroque period, so this is the time of the Counter-Reformation, we have art being affected by the new patrons of the arts. So the Spanish Jesuit reformers, this was a group that was started, the Jesuit order was started during the Baroque period, and they had many churches and paintings and sculptures made during this time to really glorify the Catholic Church. And this is also the time of the Spanish Inquisition. So people were being, in court, basically proving that they sinned or proving against that they sinned against the Catholic Church. Many of them losing their lives or their livelihoods in jail. So the first artist we have is actually not Spanish, but he worked in Spain. And when you look at the work of El Greco, you might be thinking, does it look Renaissance or does it look Mannerist? And you probably can really understand by looking at this, get an idea that he probably is a lot more Mannerist than he is Renaissance in characteristics. So let's look at some of the characteristics that we see. So with his work, you can see that it has this kind of psychological emotion. You see the sense of drama in the pose. It feels otherworldly, especially in the second half. It's kind of strange. We have some strange sort of proportions, especially in the top. Jesus is really small. And then we have these exaggerated figures at the top. The lighting's very dramatic. And then we have people dressed in contemporary day, the T of post. And so you see a lot of those characteristics in his work. El Greco was really influenced by a series of things. He was born on the island of Crete. His name means the Greek, but he's actually Cretan. And so he was born there. And so the traditional Greek Byzantine icon painting was the tradition in which he learned how to work. He then moved to Venice. And so he knew with artists like Titian and Tintoretto. So those very emotional oil painters. He eventually moved to Spain for patrons. And so he was really interested in Spanish mysticism that came out of the Counter-Reformation. The Flemish detail, all that intricate detail, especially what you see at the bottom half of this painting, was all done based on some of those traditional Flemish painting that we studied. And then, of course, mannerism, style, and composition. So this is the burial of Count Gauze, I should say. And this painting is actually placed right above his tomb. So you actually see his body being lowered into the tomb that's right directly underneath. And so when we look up close, we can see the cast of characters, all these people who would have lived in the village in which he was buried. You also see some recognizable people. This is Velasquez right here. And I believe this is Velasquez's son. And then on the top half, we have the depiction of heaven. And so you see the wispy body of Count Gauze, I should say, coming up to the heavens, being greeted by Jesus. And thinking about the perspective, it would have made this painting look even like bigger because it has this exaggerated perspective. So we see all these Old Testament prophets. We see Peter with his set of keys there. And so when you look at his style, very Mannerist, very otherworldly, normally very dramatic, dark backgrounds, maybe scenes of Toledo in the background. Here's Laocoon, so that Hellenistic sculpture that we studied of Greek mythology. So looking at some other Spanish artists, The 17th century Spanish painting had many influences, one coming from the north in Flanders. They obviously knew what had taken place in the early Renaissance in Florence and Rome, as well as what was happening in contemporary Rome. So the style of Caravaggio, these very intense religious pieces with dramatic lighting. Once again, all based on the Counter-Reformation. So things like still lifes were very common, possible that they might have had some disguised symbolism, intricate detail like we saw in the north. These works were made in oil. Saints and martyrs were very popular during the Counter-Reformation. This is one that we know. This saint, we looked at him in the Last Supper. Remember when we looked at the image of Michelangelo with his skin coming off? Or where his skin has been taken off, that's Saint Bartholomew. So here we see him waiting, right, and looking up at the heavens, waiting for God to whatever happens may happen. And then here we see his executioner with his blade, with just a little glint of it in the darkness. But here you actually see him losing his skin, right? So sacrificing for his faith, a Counter-Reformation theme. So a lot pious monks, priests, people who would do anything for their faith. The most famous artist of this period is Diego Velázquez. And so here's an early image of a water cellar. You notice how his jug is emphasized. It kind of speaks to his profession. But notice how he kind of goes back into the darkness. And that's a very Baroque sort of style, very Caravaggio-esque, where there's this dramatic difference between the light and the dark, and that the background really is dark. Velasquez was a very important portrait painter, so he painted the who's who. This is an image of the Pope that he did. One of the things you might notice is the brushstroke that he had here. Notice how loose it is. And how he create these very satiny sort of finishes to it. So he was a master of brushstroke. So the piece that's in the 250 is Las Meninas by Diego Velázquez. And this was made for the Spanish monarchy. So we're going to break apart this image and try to figure out why it's so important. If you get a chance, feel free to watch this video, which goes through a very lengthy explanation of it. And I would recommend you looking at it. I'm not going to record it because it's copyright and I want my video to be posted. But let's go ahead and break it down. So possible functions of the painting. It is a portrait of the royal family, right? So it has Princess Margarita getting her portrait taken and probably her ladies of waiting with her as well. We also have people behind this group, nun and probably a teacher. So these are the two people kind of in control of her education. We see the artist himself. So this painting might show his status as the artist. And then in the background, there's numerous paintings. I'll go back to the original, numerous paintings hanging on the wall that might have been Velasquez's work or works in the collection of the Habsburgs. So when you think about what is in this painting, it's really organized, and the brushstroke and the lighting is really important to the total understanding. Let's look at this just a little deeper. So we have Princess Margarita kind of in this kind of casual sort of pose, maybe not formally being painted, and we have these little ladies in waiting kind of waiting for her. Or attending to her. And so there's some of them are her age, some of them are older, and they're in the front, right? And then behind them, we have the educators and then the artist. Notice how he's dressed really nicely. He also has insignia that shows that he is a member of the court. And then behind them, we have a man in the door. So is he a butler? Is he the father? Who knows? And then there's a reflection. And the reflection is actually the king and queen. You can spot a Habsburg anyway. You should Google it and see what you come up with. So when we look at this, we're often thought about, what is he painting? So many scholars believe that this whole painting is what is being painted. So it's this scene that's being painted. Others think that this reflection, right? This doesn't look like a painting. It looks like it's maybe a mirror. Maybe it's a reflection of the painting there. I think it might be a different angle. I have a feeling that it's this entire painting, right? But let's look at the organization. Notice how most of the action takes place up front, very Renaissance-like, correct? And then think about the unique angle of the painting, right? It's got linear perspective to kind of create this visual depth. So it has that kind of complex arrangement that we saw in the Renaissance. The brushstroke is very visible. When you look at her skirt, it's not modeled perfection. You see individual brushstrokes. You see individual brushstrokes in her hair, right? Also notice his hand is not nearly as defined. It actually looks like it's like caught in motion. And keep in mind that this was before the invention of photography. Look at the brushstroke in the satin. You see the touch of the artist. And so this emphasizes the fact that this could be a painting about painting, right? The act of making a painting, and so on. So that really kind of emphasizes his vision as an artist, right? So a little bit looser in style. That's where we're going to stop.